Hello and welcome to Mabinda TV. So for now, this is I'm analyzing the presidential prospects of Kalonzo Musyoka. Do you think Kalonzo Musyoka has what it takes in order to be president? Of course, Kalonzo Musyoka has indicated that he will be on the ballot and has even trademarked Kalonzo 2027. So do you think Kalonzo Musyoka stands in good chance to be president of the country? Of course, then we will have to look at the running mate of Kalonzo Musyoka. Will it be Edwin Sifuna? Will it be Edwin Sifuna? Will it be Fred Matiang'i or Regazi Gachagua? Of course, Edwin Sifuna comes in as the leader of the Gen Zs. That is what Edwin Sifuna comes in. He comes in as the leader of the Gen Zs, and I think that is something to really watch out for. And I think what this means then is that Kalonzo Musyoka really has could be the one to beat in the 2027 elections. He has been the running mate to Kalonzo Musyoka has been the running mate to Raila Odinga in 2013 and 2017, and of course in 2022 he was persuaded to step aside for Martha Karua. So basically, I think he is the most experienced politician at present. Of course, he is the senior of William Ruto, and of course, William Ruto says Kalonzo Musyoka has been in government for all this while. Why has he not basically? Why has he not been tarmacked the road to his rural home? So that is the prospects that is Kalonzo Musyoka. So I think for now, then what we will need to do is to just see whether Kalonzo Musyoka is going to be a formidable presidential candidate. Of course, according to the Tipo poll, Kalonzo Musyoka commands about 24. William Ruto commands about 24% of the opinion poll, and then of course you have Kalonzo Musyoka following with 19%, and then of course you have Fred Matiang'i at 14%, and of course Rigathi Gachagua at 9% and Edwin Sifuna at 10%. So basically, Kalonzo Musyoka is going to be the one to watch out. So I think he is a social democrat. I think Kalonzo Musyoka is a social democrat. So what social democrats do is that they advance equality of opportunity. They want that is what social democrats do. They want the cake to be shared equitably. And so Kalonzo Musyoka sees so many ills of the route of presidency. And of course, that is why he is going to fight hard so that to look at President William Ruto when Kenyans are agitating for a reduction in fuel prices. President Ruto is in Kazakhstan. He doesn't even mention take part in the fuel crisis in Kenya. So of course he's going to come back today, but of course you can't be sure on that. And I think William Ruto promised the Mama Mboga, the border guy, he promised that he would. William Ruto promised that he would make their life better. So what changed? What happened? And I think that is why. And then, of course, we need a president that truly cares for the Kenyan people. Of course, the question among many Kenyans is whether Kenya should celebrate that it is not Somalia or South Sudan, or whether Kenya should mourn that it is not South Korea or Singapore. But I think what we need right now is just to ensure that I think what we need right now is to ensure that the president works for the people, that the president is going to work for the people. That is what we really need to. The president is going to work for the people. But if the president does not work for the people, look at President William Ruto. He is in a campaign mode. For God's sake, he is the commander in chief. Why not take that and run with it? Why not take that commander in chief and run with it? And I think that is something that we must really interrogate. So, what will it take to beat William Ruto? Number one, the opposition has to be united. Of course, Ruto has lost quite a chunk of the Mount Kenya votes, and I think that is something that we must think through. Ruto has lost quite a chunk of the Mount Kenya votes, and of course, will be looking at how can he fill up the Mount Kenya vote. Of course, maybe Ruto insiders have decided that if President Moi ruled without the Mount Kenya vote, then basically they can also win without the Mount Kenya. But remember, 10 counties are majority Kikuyu counties. You can't count them, and so that's 8 million votes. In fact, Raila Odinga beat William Ruto in 6 of the 8 provinces. William Ruto only won Rift Valley and Central Kenya, but it was, of course, enough to ensure that he won the presidency by 200,000 votes. And of course, this time, if the Mount Kenya votes uh, don't align with William Ruto, then of course you can't be sure that he will lose the presidency. So I think for now, what we need to be ensuring is that what the opposition needs to do is to combine their forces. They cannot beat the president on a divided ground. Of course, there are remarks that Rigathi Gachagua is laying the might of the Mount Kenya vote and saying he should be supported. But I think Rigathi Gachagua should play the kingmaker. I don't think he will be able to cooperate if he stands up for the presidency. That is Rigathi Gachagua. I'm not sure he will go far if he stands for the presidency. That is why I think he needs to support someone that will be able to carry the day. And I think in this case, the most experienced politician is Kalonzo Musyoka. So why shouldn't they support Kalonzo Musyoka? I think what needs to happen is that the opposition must be able to be united. Look at 2002, all opposition came together and dislodged President Moi from power. It was Raila Odinga who said Kibaki Tosha, and then they went with that carrot, and that is how they were able to dislodge President Moi from power. So I think what right now needs to happen is that the opposition needs to be united. Look at 2002, they defeated Uhuru Kenyatta, Kanu's candidate, because they came together. That is the opposition. So they need to be united in all respects. And so that will mean they sit down in a room, hammer out a unity pact so that then they confront one presidential candidate against President William Ruto. If they go their separate ways, then they will be hanged separately. And I think that is how then Ruto could be in for a second term. I think Kenya has never had a one term president. Kenya has never had a one term president. And I don't think President and Ruto insiders say Ruto is not about to become the first one term president. That is what Ruto insiders are saying. But I think and I just think what the opposition needs to do is they need to be united, and I think they will dislodge William Ruto from power. That is how the opposition will be able to win power if they can be united. And I think if they are united, then Kenya will be. And I think it is very difficult to beat an incumbent president. They control the courts, they control an incumbent president controls the courts, an incumbent president controls the police, the army, and of course, they appoint the electoral referee. That is why it is so difficult to beat an incumbent president. But I think what really needs to happen is that the opposition must realize they will be hung separately. And so if they come together, that is how this country is in need of reforms. This country is in need of two reforms. And I think that is why then we must ensure that the country takes along the same direction. That is why we need to ensure that the country works. Look at the look at the SHA with teething problems. Look at the lack of capitation for students in schools. Basically, the free primary and pre-secondary education are coming across. For instance, in the free secondary education, the capitation was cut down from 20 22,000 to right now 14,000. So you can see that President William Ruto is not going to fulfill the mandate of a free secondary education. This is why I guess that the opposition really needs to come together and dislodge President William Ruto from power. Of course, it is very difficult to beat an incumbent president in Africa, but there have been some opposition wins in Africa. There have been some opposition wins in Africa. You have in Zambia in 2021, Hakainde Hichilema beat the incumbent president Edgar Lungu. In Botswana, the incumbent president lost. Magwisi lost to the opposition candidate Duma Boko, and I think in Senegal, the opposition candidate Diomaye Faye beat the ruling party candidate Adama Barrow. So I think what needs to happen is that the opposition must lay down ground strategies in order to dislodge President William Ruto from power, and that is how then the opposition can win. Look at the opposition win in 2002. You had the conservative weekly news magazine, The Economist, branding Kenya as a beacon of hope for Africa. You have The Economist branding Kenya as a beacon of hope for Africa. And then, of course, you have in 2002, you had Cabinet Minister Karisa Maiza openly sweeping the streets in a new show of servant leadership. And then, of course, in the year 2002, still you had citizens openly arresting corrupt police officers, saying in a newfound sense of zero tolerance on corruption. So that's the kind of euphoria we need. Yote yawezekana bila Moi. That is what the opposition sang in 2002. Yote yawezekana bila Moi. And I think right now, then William Ruto could be a one-term president, and that is the unity that the opposition should be seeking. I think the presidency in Kenya has been rotated between Rift Valley and Central Kenya for far too long. I think now we need another region, maybe Ukambani. Of course, Rigathi Gachagua calls them cousins, that is the Kambas. Of course, Kambas have been behind Raila Odinga in two of his presidential contests, but of course, then and now the Kalonzo Musyoka says if he does not contest the presidency, and now then when will he contest the presidency? So basically, I think right now and Kalonzo Musyoka could choose Edwin Sifuna. Of course, Edwin Sifuna is tribeless, and I think he could be the leader of the Gen Zs. That is Edwin Sifuna. He could be the leader of the Gen Zs. Of course, the Gen Zs say they are tribeless, they are leaderless, but I think they need now a leader who will be able to fashion that whole support of the Gen Zs towards the Gen Zs have no one to represent them at the table. That is just the fact of the matter. The Gen Zs have no one to represent them at the seat of the bargaining seat, and I think that is something that we must think along. Why are the Gen Zs leaderless? And I think Edwin Sifuna could be their leader. Look at the way he has carried the country with the Linda Mwananchi group, and I think Edwin Sifuna is going to be the leader of the Gen Zs. I think that is how then we could have a president that truly sticks it out for the people. So, of course, Edwin Sifuna is that leader that is going to be the leader of the Gen Zs. Then we look at Fred Matiang'i. He came to the limelight during President Uhuru Kenyatta. He was the de facto prime minister during the Uhuru Kenyatta's regime. Of course, Fred Matiang'i is a technocrat, and technocrats don't have a lot of connection to the peasants. So technocrats, I say this is the problem. This is how we are going to solve it, and I think. Then Fred Matiang'i, in that case, he came to the limelight when he reduced the number of S to just 141 in the entire country. That is Fred Matiang'i. So Fred Matiang'i called also, of course, he carries the Kisi votes. The Kisis have not had a kingpin since Simeon Nyachai in 2002. Of course, Simeon Nyachai contested the presidency when he did not agree that Mike Kibaki will be a formidable candidate. So, of course, you have the Kisis. Of course, you have the Kisis having their leader as Fred Matiang'i. So I think Fred Matiang'i could be the one to really ensure that the government is working. Of course, people like Fred Matiang'i could be great leaders in countries such as China, but I think right now it is not possible to be that kind of candidate. I think Fred Matiang'i could be given a powerful ministry in the Kalonzo Musyoka government, and I think he will run it just as effectively. So I think right now opposition is speaking with so many different voices, but I think they need to tune in and speak with one voice. That's how the opposition is going to carry the day. That's how the opposition is going to carry the day. If they don't speak with one voice, then basically they will not produce a president. And of course, William Ruto will beat them hands down. Of course, President Ruto is saying that they will present a report card to Kenyans. Then Kenyans will mark. They will do an exam, and then Kenyans will mark and on who has gotten the highest marks. That is, but of course, for opposition, the work is to point out the mistakes of the Ruto presidency, and of course, then point out that Ruto is bad for this country. So I think that is the way Kalonzo Musyoka could be that formidable candidate. Of course, he comes with his own. Of course, during his time, there was nothing like CDF, and of course, he was the vice president. But of course, then William Ruto says, "Why have you not developed a tarmac road in your region?" That is what William Ruto tells Kalonzo Musyoka. That is, why have you not developed a tarmac to your rural home. So basically, that, according to Ruto, is diverting public resources to private bank accounts. So I think for now, what needs to happen, the opposition come up with ideologies, come up with issues. Let Kenyans rally around a cause. Of course, in every election in Kenya, there has been a rallying call. In 2002, it was in 1992, it was multi-party democracy. In 2002, it was anti-Moi, Moi must go. In 2007, it was 41 against 1 against the Kikus. In 2013, it was about the ICC. And of course, Ruto would like to say that in 2022, it was about hustlers versus dynasty. But of course, now President William Ruto is the dynasty himself. That is what we must know. That is President William Ruto himself right now. He is a dynasty. Look at the cabinet ministers under President William Ruto. They are billionaires. Basically, the cabinet ministers in President Ruto's cabinet, they are millionaires. They are billionaires. How do you become a billionaire in Kenya? That is, you just have to be close to power. You don't have to produce anything. You don't have to have companies that employs thousands of people. All you need to do is to just steal public wealth, and that is how you become a billionaire in Kenya. So that needs to change. The opposition in Kenya must rally around. They must be able to. They must be able to rally around and, in effect, be that voice of the people. That is how we are going to have Ruto as one-term president. Why does Ruto think? Of course, Ruto says is unsure whether he should select a running mate from Mount Kenya, but I think that has gone off for now. I think the running mate for William Ruto will be Professor Kithure Kindiki. Ruto does not believe he has lost the Mount Kenya vote and thinks that this vote is still in his bag. But I think that vote is gone. The Mount Kenya vote is gone, and I think that is how President William Ruto could end up being Kenya's first one-term president. So, of course, Kalonzo Musyoka is a social democrat, and I think social democrats, by and large, social democrats are about sharing the cake equitably, and I think that is how we need to conduct affairs in Kenya. A report by the Daily Nation showed that for every 1 shilling that a poor person in Kenya makes, a rich person makes 56 shillings. So basically, that is how you can imagine it. That is for every for 1 shilling, a poor person in Kenya makes a rich person makes 56 shillings. But that is something that we really need to interrogate so that then we can have a country where people, we don't need 10 billionaires and 10 million beggars. Of course, JM Karaoke said Kenya is a country of 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars, but that needs to change. Kenya needs to be that country where the cake is shared out equitably. So basically, look at young people. They have no jobs. They have no jobs. People are graduating, some with even masters and PhD, but they don't have any job at all. And I think that is something that we really must interrogate. People are graduating with no jobs at all, and I think that is something that we must really interrogate. How is it that how is it that we are able to go? How is it that people are graduating with no jobs? And I think that is something that we really must interrogate. People must be able to have jobs. That is the way to develop this country. So basically, a presidential ticket should be about what will you do for Kenyans? What is your plan for Kenyans? What is your plan for Kenyans? That is the way I think we need to interrogate this thing. Otherwise, we will remain with the same old leadership and same old way of doing things, and I don't think that will be in store for us. So for now, the beauty about this election is that there is no front runner. So basically, it will have to be fought. This election will have to be fought on the basis of issues, and this is the way that this election could be won. So, of course, Kalonzo Musyoka's Edwin Sifuna ticket is on the offing, and of course, there is also Kalonzo Musyoka, Fred Matiang'i ticket, and of course, Kalonzo Musyoka Rigathi Gachagua ticket. Of course, Gachagua thinks he has the biggest voting bloc. Of course, the DCP party is doing well in central Kenya. And of course, look at the by-elections in Amuro Dikir in Narok. Basically, the opposition, DCP party, got a candidate who was second. And I think the rise in popularity of the DCP party is unsettling for President William Ruto. Of course, that is something that President William Ruto is really looking at. How come the DCP party is rising? And of course, for Rigathi Gachagua, a lot of central seats in central Kenya will be picked up by DCP. And so, of course, you have the Muranga governor, Irungu Kangata, has said that he will not be defending his ticket on a UDA ticket. So that is severing ties with President William Ruto. How does he say he was one of the closest allies of President William Ruto? That is Muranga Governor Irongo Kangata. So he says he will not be defending his seat on IUDA ticket. So basically, a lot of people in central Kenya are going to decamp from UDA, and UDA is going to end up being a party from the Rift Valley, a party of the Kalenjin. So UDA is going to end up being a party of the Rift Valley. And so, of course, central Kenya will move along to DCP party, and that is how then these elections are going to be conducted. So basically, what we need to be doing is to ensure that the opposition speaks with one voice, and the opposition gets to speak with one voice. That is the way that we could remake the opposition so that then they speak with one voice. So, Kalonzo, what do you think about the Kalonzo Musyoka Rigathi Gachagua ticket? I think for Kalonzo Musyoka Rigathi Gachagua ticket, it will be about bringing the Mount Kenya votes. But remember, tribal elections in Kenya are conducted on tribal basis. Don't forget that elections in Kenya are conducted on tribal basis. So if maybe the Kiku's look and they are not in the running mate ticket, then maybe they will have to vote for President William Ruto. Remember, elections in Kenya is about tribal arithmetic. There is nothing like ideology. There's nothing like issues, or a development record for that matter, as the star columnist Wycliffe Muga puts it. So basically, elections in Kenya are conducted based on what is the surname of the electoral candidate? Is he our own? He could be bad, but then of course, if he is of our tribe, then we will vote them in. That is how elections in Kenya are conducted. So basically, this will be a tribal election as all other ones have been. Of course, maybe with the Gen Alphas, maybe with the Gen Zs, it will change. But of course, a lot of Gen Zs don't have to vote. In the last election in 2022, 8 million Kenyans did not vote. 8 million Kenyans did not vote. So basically, that shows you, and a lot of them were young voters. So basically, the Nico Kadi movement has to ensure that these young Kenyans are able to vote, and that is how we could ensure that the young people vote for the opposition, and basically this country has a change. Anything I think right now is better than the route of presidency. That is how then will ensure that the route of presidency becomes a one-term presidency. So for now, we will look at the other running mates. Of course, also there could be Babu Wino as the running mate to Kalonzo Musyoka. Of course, he has 5 degrees, and so of course he is educated. That is Babu Wino. He is emerging as the regional kingpin of Luo Nyanza. Of course, he faces competition to fill up that void left by Raila Odinga. Of course, the appointment for Luo Nyanza has still not been found. Of course, Kenya politics is conducted around ethnic kingpin. So you have to command the support of your region first. You have to be an ethnic kingpin in Kenya first before you are able to be elected as a leader. And I think that is the way then we could frame the Kenyan politics. So Kalonzo comes with the company vote, Sifuna comes with the Luya vote, or maybe the Gen Z's vote, then Gachagua comes with the Mount Kenya vote, and Matiang'i comes with the Kisii vote. Of course, Justin Muturi comes with the Embu and Meru vote. So that is how Kenyan politics is negotiated, and then you negotiate for a position uh, based on the voting block that you carried. So that is how politics in Kenya is conducted. So our politics is conducted around tribal arithmetic. That is why we vote based along tribal lines, and I think that could be the reason why then Kenya does not go far, because we don't evaluate a candidate based on their development or their track record. We simply look at the voting at the surname of the electoral candidate. We look at the tribe, and that is the major undoing of the Kenyan politics. We look at the tribe, and then we decide that this person does not come from my tribe, so I will not vote them in. And that just destroys the nature of our politics. That just weeds out good candidates. There are people who could be great leaders in this country, but they are ruled out because they come from smaller tribes. Or maybe what we should be doing is to have a rotating presidency that will ensure that we maybe the presidency is rotated around the various regions of the country. That is the way then that we could have a rotating presidency, maybe like the UN Secretary General position is rotated between the various continents of the world. Maybe Africa had a chance during the Kofi Annan era, or maybe we could have a gentleman's agreement like Nigeria, where the presidency rotates between the north and the south, and then the country is able to move forward. So a rotating presidency maybe is something that we could think through. A rotating presidency could be the thing that helps Kenya become really a rotating presidency is the thing that could help Kenya be that go and be harmonious in leadership. So a rotating presidency could be what we need. But I think and the tribes that have produced a presidency, I don't think maybe they will accept to have a rotating presidency. So maybe that is something that we could think through. Think of Raila Odinga. He possessed so many qualities, but yet never ascended to the presidency because maybe the Mount Kenya, the Kikus just did not believe in Raila Odinga. Maybe they felt a threat from him. Maybe they felt he could retribute them. So, of course, Raila Odinga died without ever becoming Kenya's president. He is Kenya's Benjamin Franklin, who was one of the independence fathers of America, but never got to be a U.S. president. So that is Raila Odinga for you. So I think Raila Odinga could be Raila Odinga was really a statesman in that he fought for this country in the streets, but then, of course, never ascended to be president. So basically, uh, so bye for now. Till the next time. Bye for now.